Today I want to talk about auditory perception and psychoactive substances. And yes, my background is actually in religious studies and anthropology. So I'm not a musician, and I'm not a musicologist, and I'm not an audiologist. I don't study how we hear. But I am a psychonaut. And the reason I've become very interested in sound in the last year particularly, I should say that I'm someone who always enjoyed music, but I wasn't especially interested in producing it. I was quite happy to listen to other people making it, but I didn't feel any need to understand it beyond enjoying it. Many years ago, I was studying DMT for my PhD. This was like a couple of decades ago. And I was very interested in DMT. And as a personal project, I thought it would be a really good idea to study all of the close analogues of DMT, personally, in myself. So to take 5-methoxy DMT and DPT and all of these other materials, we're very lucky at the time there wasn't a Federal Drug Analogue Act, so I felt kind of comfortable doing this stuff. So I went through a series of these analogues, but I balked at a substance called DIPT, diisopropyltryptamine. And the reason I was reluctant to have it and put it on the back burner for a very long time is because of its reputation for producing very extreme audio distortion in the listener. Now, I'd be very interested to know who here has tried DIPT. There are a couple. I'd be very interested in hearing your experience. And did you also have auditory distortions? Yeah, okay. It's a very unusual tryptamine, and it doesn't behave the way that close analogues like 5-methoxy DIPT or DPT behave. It has a unique effect. So that got me very, very interested because I had taken pitch perception for granted. I just assumed that harmony was out there in the world, that I didn't have to do something in my brain to make this harmony between particular frequencies that gave me this emotional feeling that spoke to my soul. I just assumed it was a thing. I took it for granted. And so having had this experience with something that took pitch away, distorted it, made the harmonies break up. To be without harmony and trying to listen to music for 30 hours of tripping, it lasted a long time for me. For some people, it's only 6 hours. So that's the impetus behind today. More broadly, I'm interested in psychedelic states and sound. What's happening when, on LSD, things sound amazing. But why is that? And there is a lot of research out there. So in the last year, I've become interested in this research. But it is a little to the side of my traditional specialities. We know that music has the power to move us, and the combination of psychedelics and music is incredible. In terms of whether music and altered states are good for our spiritual development or not, there are conflicting points of view in world religions. There are points of view where music is seen as a very useful tool in spiritual development, and others where it's seen as a kind of maya, a kind of distraction, an illusion. So the idea of whether music is conducive or not is contested in spiritual traditions. It's very interesting when we become very dependent on music. It's very interesting when we just try to do things in silence as well, because music is obviously a very useful mind tool. It has the power to move us emotionally. And this is unusual because they're just these sound frequencies coming together. You know, why do they move us? Why do they speak to our soul? Why can someone play music and move everyone who's there with that music? What is it about it that does that? It can move our bodies and get us up and dancing in unison and being as one body. Rhythms can do all kinds of things. So this is an example of a single rhythm that some musicologists studying initiation into the Mitsogo branch of Bwiti. They noticed that there were very, very particular rhythms that were being played. One of them, there was a 6x2 rhythm, a polyrhythm, and a 4/3 polyrhythm, and they were playing within a 12-bar measure for the entire night. Now, the ideas, the traditional ideas behind these rhythms, they have specific meanings. So the 4 beats is associated with this world that we live in, and the 3 beat is associated with the spiritual world. So when you play a 4/3 rhythm, you're mixing the worlds together, and the listener is alternating. They're trying to work out what rhythm they're listening to. Are they listening to the 4, which is like a march, or the 3, which is a bit more like a waltz? And so they're alternating between these two rhythmic worlds. And that's having very deep neurological effects because the auditory cortex and the parts of the brain that it connects to are very, very powerful parts of our consciousness. Music has a relationship to language. There is neural mirroring going on when we speak. As you listen to me, your neural states come to resemble mine. This is a neural mirroring process that's part of communication. So in terms of music, that neural mirroring between the performer and the audience means that people can fall into the same kind of neural patterns. They're different because they're not playing, they're listening, but nonetheless there's a communication, a neural mirroring that goes on. The music is also connecting to not just language formulation, but also imagery. So there's a visual cortex at the back of the brain that the auditory cortex connects with. And we can see this particularly in people who have colour, sound, synesthesia, where they actually see colours when they hear particular notes. It's totally automatic for them. It helps them to have absolute pitch because they can see that, in this case, that the D flat is red. So they know when they're hearing a D flat. But this is the kind of possibilities that are there between the auditory processing cortex and the visual cortex. They can produce these kinds of flows of information. These are two different synesthetes who see the keyboard in two different ways. When they hear it in two different ways. Of course, this has implications for healing melodies, the icaros that are so important in some forms of ayahuasca healing. It has implications for the peyote songs in Navajo and Sioux that are part of the Native American church. These are ways where the language centers, the auditory cortex, connect to the visual cortex. They create images. They link in with personal memory and our ideas of who we are. So the healing power is related to these different kinds of networks that develop. And of course, these networks are changed when we have a psychedelic in conjunction with music. It's a very powerful combination. Sound, of course, is waves in the air, essentially, and different frequencies of wave we hear as different pitches. When I talk about DIPT a bit more, this is important to know that different pitches are different vibrations, different frequencies of vibration. So different frequency vibrations would give different names, such as G or A or B flat or whatever. As the sound moves up an octave, as we go from the first day to the next day, the same neural systems, the same nerves are firing each time. But as you go up octaves and the pitch becomes higher, it's a subset of the same neurons that fire each time. So that's why a C sounds like a C every time. But as it goes higher, which is essentially the doubling of the frequency rate, each time the frequency rate doubles, the same nerves fire, but it's a subset, so the sound is higher and thinner. As we're tuned at the moment, as we hear at the moment, particular frequencies go well with each other. And in Western music, the entire theory of harmony is based on the relationships between pitch that we see in this diagram, the circle of fifths, or it's also the circle of fourths. I won't go into the music theory because I don't really have time, and it's not my area. But basically, the correct perception of all the pitches that you're hearing are essential to get the effect of a harmony that creates a pleasant emotional state that moves you, that produces this effect of harmony. Even if some of the pitches go out, the relationships break up and the harmony disintegrates. And some psychoactive substances will do that. The timbre is the little overtones within the wave frequency, which is why a human voice sounds richer than a tuning fork when it's producing the same note. So timbre is these little micro, like these overtones, harmonic overtones within the wave frequency of the pitch. Now that's interesting when we get to some of the research on LSD and music that Mendel Kaelin conducted. I'll just briefly read this. We found that the interaction between music and LSD increases information going from the parahippocampus, which is a quite deep brain region, which specializes in personal memory, back to the visual cortex. So there's this link when we hear with LSD between personal memory and vision that music activates. It's not there without the music. We also saw increased brain activity in response to timbre, so those microtones. And that was apparent in the Broca area, which formulates language. So we need to correctly interpret the emotional tone of whoever's been talking to us before we can formulate our response to that person. And so it's important that the language center for formulating language is sensitive to timbre. So these areas are stimulated by LSD. And look at substances that are known to have musical qualities, psychoactive substances that interact with music perception. There are a range of them that are considered teachers of music, so I'll briefly touch on those. There are plants like the elder, which is thought to teach music in some cultures, in Canada and in Europe as well. But they're also a source of manufacturing flutes, so there's a sort of a couple of elements there. It's a plant that produces instruments as well as teaches music. But the Ayusacha is an interesting plant, the garlic vine. It's known to teach Icaros to people studying vegetalismo in Peru. So this plant will teach people healing songs and enhance their general musicality, mostly during their dreams. But also it changes the way that music is listened to and played when people have a strong tea of this plant and then play music. It's a different kind of listening. Other tutelary plants are more sinister. So this Solandra, the Kieri spirit among the Huichol Indians in Mexico, is known to be able to teach people to play the fiddle very quickly. But it asks a very sinister price for that. I won't go into that, but it's a realm of sorcery, essentially. So there are a number of tutelary plants that teach music. Just briefly, that idea of learning to play the fiddle seems to be in some ways a European introduction as well, as of course is the fiddle. That's not a Mexican instrument, it's a European instrument. So we find examples from Tartini to Paganini, and more recently Robert Johnson, and many, many rock stars, of course, that made deals to learn music. So that's an interesting element. The dissociative anaesthetics, I had to mention that nitrous oxide produces some very peculiar auditory effects and enhances listening. These dissociative anaesthetics, music is the most constant sense, the sense that remains when most of the other senses become dissociated. So it's a kind of a golden thread for the dissociative experience. These puffballs from southern Mexico are used by the Mixtec for clairvoyance, for clairaudience in particular. They hear spirits with these. I haven't tried them. I'd be very keen to. Just putting it out there if anyone has any experience or practical knowledge with these puffballs. They're quite fascinating, but I know very little about them. And there's very little in the literature as well. Hamea salicifolia, the Sinakuchi plant, is also known to alter musical perception. But I want to get to DIPT because it is a very unusual, probably quite a useful pharmacological tool for experiencing pitch distortion, but also exploring it and understanding it. It happens that 4% of people are born with amusia. So the disruption of pitch is actually quite common. There are a lot of people who don't perceive pitch the same way as others. And consequently, music is not a pleasant experience for them necessarily. It can be quite abrasive because they're not hearing the harmonies. So it can be annoying and it can be distressing. And once again, going back to the circle of fifths, when some of the pitches shift in this circle, all of the harmonics related to that pitch stop working. It's like playing the wrong note with the wrong note. It doesn't take very many of them and suddenly the harmonics disintegrates. There are a number of medicinal substances that are used in Western allopathy that produce amusia in some people. It's usually a rare side effect, but it's been well documented for this anticonvulsant. And rather unfortunately for some beta blockers, which musicians sometimes use for their stage fright. So it's a difficult experience for them if they have to take a beta blocker, get on stage and realize that their pitch is out. They can't actually play and the music sounds terrible anyway. So some beta blockers also disrupt pitch perception. And some of the tryptamines, this analog of psilocin, 4-acetoxy-MET, is also known to grossly disrupt pitch at higher doses. But the really exceptional one is DIPT. So di-isopropyltryptamine was invented by Alexander Shulgin. It's a tryptamine, it's an isomer of DPT, which is a profound visual psychedelic, but its effects are almost entirely auditory, but they are extreme. Things sound just like you have never heard them on this particular substance, and it's a very intense material. It's speedy and psilocin-like a low dose of mushrooms as well, so it does have other psychedelic, it affects ideation, you're definitely tripping. But the sound effects, especially after an hour or so, suddenly you're having a conversation and you realize that everything sounds weird. So there's some, this is a quote from someone who tried it. 250 milligrams, which incidentally is what my partner and I had. It's the upper end of what Sugan recommends. It's a very high dose. But we kind of figured we'd only do it once because it didn't sound like a very pleasant experience. So we thought, oh, we'll just dive in and have a decent dose of it and see what it's like. DIPT was the body of Satan. The voices of people were extremely distorted. Males sounded like frogs. Children sounded like they were talking through synthesizers to imitate outer space people in science fiction movies. In fact, I felt that I was somehow sent into an anti-universe where everything looked the same as normal, but was a cold and empty imitation. I felt I was a fallen angel. It's actually rather like how we both felt, my partner and I, when we had this. Harmony is really, really important to people who perceive harmony. And when it's taken away, it is like a fall from grace. So this is something that I never realized because I was surrounded by it constantly. But to have it removed, it's a very, very interesting sensation. I couldn't wait for it to end, but that didn't stop me from playing lots and lots and lots of music to get the most out of it while I was there, just to explore the distortions. Everything sounded terrible. It wasn't until 30 hours later that things started to sound in tune again. So it's quite extreme. This is a diary entry. What a curveball that was. Totally not expecting such a completely novel and unique effect. Nice to know the mind still has some totally bizarre surprises. Not exactly pleasant, actually quite offensive, but so interesting. So glad to have pitch returning to normal, tones no longer transposed, and harmonic relationships restored, well, mostly. Very persistent effect, 24 hours of sound distortion. I absolutely didn't know that was all possible. Grateful for the intensely odd experience, but definitely not my cup of tea. No one knows how it works. And I had to say too that the science of audiology doesn't seem to be very advanced in comparison to the science of how we see. So I don't know. I mean, maybe someone does, and that's something for question time if anyone has any good experimental data on this. There are a number of places where pitch perception can malfunction. In the inner ear, in the cochlea, there is a pitch sensitive area. The cochlea is pitch sensitive. It has a high pitch responsive end and a low pitch responsive end, and these ends send to the nervous system. They go up through the auditory processing chain to the auditory cortex, and the auditory cortex mirrors the cochlea in that it has a high frequency end and a low frequency end. This is another place where maybe things are going wonky. So we don't know if it's something to do with maybe muscle relaxation in the cochlea affecting the acoustics at one end of it, or whether it's a higher process. It's just not clear. But it does affect lower pitches more than higher pitches. So very high notes are almost right. They might be just a little bit flat, but very low notes are completely out. So a C might sound like the F sharp below or something like that. It's just completely out of whack. A friend of mine, Richard Barron, came around and helped my partner and I to try to approximate some of the effects. It's not exact, but it gives you some idea of what we were hearing. So we tampered with the sound parameters of this track and tried to get it into the general zone of DIPT to give you some sense. Just remember that you can't actually turn this effect off when you're on DIPT. You're stuck with it. Now, of course, the first thing in our playlist, our electronic playlist, was ABBA. It's right at the beginning. So that was the first thing that we tried. Also, we didn't want to try music that we were really attached to as well, because I've read that it can really leave scars if you listen to music that you really like on this substance, and certainly don't go to a concert within 2 days of it. So it's enough. That's enough of that. So that gives you a sense of what's happening. It's actually a little bit worse than that. You'd have to individually alter each note to really get it. You'd have to actually screw with every lower note more than every upper note. create envelopes to protect the higher notes and then really tamper with the lower notes to really get the effect. But we didn't have much time to get this together. But you get a sense of how wonky everything sounds. And certainly if you're wanting the music to carry you through this difficult tripping experience, it's not going to happen. We also listened to different styles of music to see what was affected. Classical music, Baroque music was just terrible because it's so dependent on harmonies. Some rhythm-driven rock was okay because rhythm was okay. Comprehension of lyrics was okay. They knew exactly what they were trying to make us feel, but there's no way we were going to feel it because we didn't have the persuasion of the harmonies. So it helped us see through music as well. It's a very, very strange state. Someone else has had a go at trying to reproduce these effects as well. So it's just really interesting to know what kind of substances are out there that are experimental, that affect the mind, that are psychedelic, but produce effects we're really not expecting. There's the Weinecker area that is involved in hearing language. I'm sure there's going to be a psychoactive drug that targets it quite specifically, where perhaps for 12 hours you can't understand a thing that anyone says. There are all kinds of things out there that we just don't actually know about yet. It'll be really interesting to discover those compounds. There'll be a bit of a shock for people when they synthesize them and taste them, but they'll be out there. There's someone else who had an attempt at trying to reproduce these DIPT effects. I won't go to the site, but there they are. It's called the Apple Core, and it's on SoundCloud. And you can get someone else's slant on this pitch shift down and the weird quality that it brings to music. But the most remarkable thing about these substances that alter pitch and disrupt harmony is that they're really, really rare. There's very, very few of them. There are a lot of psychoactive drugs, and I've eaten a lot of them. But it took a long time before I got to something that genuinely screwed with harmonics. So what's really interesting is that harmony is resilient. For those who have harmony, it's an incredibly resilient sense. All of these other drugs can just get into the bloodstream and all of a sudden, wow, the walls are melting and, my body feels amazing or whatever, but it's protected somehow. It's like it's a citadel. Sound is like a citadel. And it is a very important sense in our evolution, both for surviving, but also in mate selection and inheritance, for passing on genes. You need to have subtle skill with interpreting language. So it's a very, very important faculty of our mind. And one of the good things about it is that it remains intact when a lot of other mental functions are impaired. So there are all sorts of useful directions in dementia treatment involving music. There are hospitals that have implemented personalised playlists for people with dementia. Now, in nursing homes, generally, a lot of them prescribe antipsychotic drugs to control the dementia symptoms, to keep people tame in the nursing homes. And these antipsychotic drugs sedate them very heavily, but they're also associated with a 50% increase in death by pneumonia. So they increase the possibility of death by pneumonia by 50%. They triple the risk of death by stroke. So it's not great that people prescribe these substances, but they're able to reduce them in these nursing homes by sedating people with personalised playlists instead of antipsychotics. So 50% reduction in the use of these dangerous drugs, which is a really good outcome. But yeah, the sense of musicality, the musical senses are really robust, which is why they're fantastic for people when they're tripping. They can be a guide through all of the turbulence and all of the disturbance of tripping, to help people to come through it and find healing and find grounding. And I guess because I hadn't really thought about it, and then all of a sudden I really needed to think about it, I just wanted to share some sense of how important that sense is in a psychedelic context. So yeah, it can be like a lighthouse in a storm at sea. And no matter how choppy it all becomes, we can ride out those sound waves. But even though everything else is disintegrating and becoming very chaotic, there's still harmony, there's still proportion, and there's still this, it's almost like the soul must have proportion, because music with its proportion speaks to the soul through all of this. So it's very interesting to have this proportion coming through, having the harmony coming through when all else is gone, except on DIPT.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. I'll be quick. I know you said it was quite awful, but do you think it could have any potential benefits for musicians to perhaps get another perspective on their music and their art to kind of go through that? Can you imagine any sort of tangible benefits that could be on, say, the other side of such an experience? Would you recommend it to musicians?
Well, I'd be very careful of recommending that to a musician, because people that I've spoken to that are musicians are divided about whether they would try it or not. Some who are very interested in the more experimental side of sound are quite keen to. Others would not go near it. It's something that they won't risk. For myself, I was not musical at all. After this substance, just synchronicity, I was given a whole heap of really beautiful, amazing instruments. And I'm getting into it because now I appreciate it. So I'm starting very late and getting into music as a consequence of it. So I would certainly recommend it for someone who's not a musician, who wants to appreciate what music is. I'm not sure about the other way around, and that really has to rest with each person, whether they want to know. It's their special. Their special gift is their awareness and appreciation of pitch, and to see what it's like without that. Partly because it would be distressing, but also, they might be worried about whether it ever goes back to normal. I'm sure it does, but that's I wouldn't want to risk it. Yeah.
With DMT and sometimes 5-methoxy DMT, you often hear music, noises, tones, ohm sounds that aren't in the room.
Yeah.
Is there any study being done on how we can? I've looked into the same phenomena of how we can see a bright light in a perfectly dark room.
It might be present, like the metallic overtones that you would have heard in the ABBA before, if you were here for the ABBA. Those metallic overtones are very similar, I guess, to the timbre differences that you encounter with 5-methoxy DMT, and the ability to focus in on particular sounds as well. That's sometimes called the cocktail party effect, by the way, when you can really, really pick out a particular.
Right, where you can hear every voice in the room.
Yeah, or we can single out a single voice in amongst it all, yeah.
Did you do any work in trying to adjust the music while you were on DIPT to make it sound right?
I didn't, and I really regret it. I would have lined up someone who had something like Ableton Push or some kind of software to be able to manipulate the music until it sounded okay, to try to quantify it, but I didn't know what it was going to do. So I didn't have that on hand. It would be really, really good to do it with someone with that kind of technology, a fairly intuitive, easy to use system of sound production. The other thing I really regret is not listening to specific pitches over several octaves to try to quantify what it was like at different octaves. I really would have, so if anyone does it, just get an instrument and play the same note up a range of octaves and see how it sounds.
I actually had the same question, if anyone had ever made music for people on DIPT, so something awful sounding that sounds good when you're in that state. And it made me think, maybe that would be used for people with amusia. You could find some cacophony that works for those people,
Yeah, absolutely. These are all totally legitimate early research questions for a substance that has, unknown benefits. It's a very, very interesting experimental substance. I'd be really interested if anyone can think of different experiments for this. Not that I'll necessarily ever try it again myself, but I'd be very keen to see how that field develops. So really interested in what kind of experiments we can come up with.